Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're taking a look at a framework that's been causing quite a stir in the Agile community.
It certainly has.
It's the Scaled Agile Framework.
Or SAFe, as most people probably know it by.
Exactly.
Yeah.
SAFe.
Yeah.
And we're not just going to kind of dip our toes in the water here.
Yeah, no.
We're going deep down into some of the potential, really controversial areas surrounding SAFe.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that we're going to be basing this deep dive on a really fascinating document called the SAFe Delusion, with the subtitle, Information for Decision Makers Considering the SAFe Framework.
So, right off the bat, they're kind of giving us a bit of a warning.
Yeah, I think what's really valuable about this document is it tries to be as objective as possible. Yeah. It's a curated collection of evidence and insights, and the authors are really emphasizing that they have no vested interest in SAFe.
That's good.
Yeah, and that's really important because so often we only hear the positive, the glowing success stories.
Yeah, the perfectly polished, marketing narratives.
Exactly.
But, anybody who's worked in the real world knows that there's always more to this story.
Absolutely. The SAFe Delusion does a great job of digging into those less told stories.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these case studies.
Okay.
Because, SAFe, they love to, kind of show off their successes.
Sure.
But what happens when we, really look under the hood?
Well, one of the most striking examples is the U.S. Air Force.
Okay.
Back in 2019, they were actually considering adopting SAFe, but ultimately decided against it.
Really?
And it's interesting because it wasn't about budget constraints or technical limitations. They actually found SAFe to be too rigid and prescriptive.
Really?
Yeah.
For the Air Force?
For the Air Force.
You would think that they would be all about structure and process.
You would think so, but they actually made a very strong statement saying that they strongly discouraged using frameworks like SAFe because they felt it contradicted their goals of promoting agility and innovation within their DevSecOps teams.
That's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting is that SAFe actually offered them free consulting.
Wow.
To try and change their minds.
They really wanted them on board.
They did, but the Air Force stood firm and said, we need a more customized approach that better suits our needs.
So the Air Force wasn't convinced?
Right.
But is this just like a one-off situation?
Well, remember Fitbit?
Oh, yeah.
For a while, they were held up as the shining example of SAFe success.
Like a poster child.
Exactly. They even presented their SAFe implementation at conferences.
Wow.
But it turns out they eventually abandoned SAFe.
What happened?
It seems that they just never achieved the growth and innovation that they had been promised. And even the executive who had been championing SAFe at Fitbit ended up leaving the company. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
And then we have the case of Volvo cars.
Okay.
They spent years and a considerable amount of resources implementing SAFe, but academic studies and internal sources have revealed that it wasn't quite the smooth ride that they had hoped for.
What went wrong at Volvo?
Well, it seems like they struggled to integrate SAFe into their existing culture. Academic studies pointed out a lack of a genuine agile mindset within the organization, despite their SAFe implementation. And to make matters worse, at least one entire department within Volvo ditched SAFe altogether.
Wow.
Because they felt it wasn't adding any value.
So they were just like, we're done.
We're done with this.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating is those teams are now reporting that they are functioning much better without SAFe.
Okay, so we've got the Air Force rejecting it. We've got Fitbit abandoning it.
Yeah.
We've got Volvo struggling to make it work. Are we seeing a pattern here?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. When you look at the case studies that have been critically examined, a consistent theme emerges.
What's that?
SAFe often fails to deliver on its promises.
So you're saying that the marketing hype doesn't always match reality?
Often not.
But okay, so we've heard from these big organizations, but what do the real Agile experts think about SAFe?
Right.
I'm talking about the people who literally wrote the Agile Manifesto.
Now that's where things get really interesting because there are a surprising number of very prominent Agile figures who have very openly spoken out against SAFe.
Okay. All right, spill the tea.
Okay, so Ron Jeffries, one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, has said that SAFe is far too complex and ignores any constructive criticism. He believes that it goes against the very essence of Agile, which emphasizes simplicity and adaptability.
Okay.
And then you've got Andy Hunt, another Agile Manifesto author, who has actually stated quite bluntly that SAFe is not Agile.
Wow.
He believes it creates more problems than it solves by adding these unnecessary layers of complexity and bureaucracy.
So strong words from the folks who literally wrote the book on Agile.
Absolutely, and it doesn't stop there.
Okay.
Martin Fowler, another Agile Manifesto author and really a highly respected figure in the software development world, has also publicly expressed his dislike of SAFe. He's gone as far as echoing the concerns raised by ThoughtWorks, which is a leading global software consultancy that has been quite critical of SAFe's approach.
So it sounds like SAFe was getting some serious pushback from the, like the Agile old guard.
It is.
But, SAFe isn't just drawing from the Agile Manifesto, right?
Right.
It incorporates a lot of ideas from other methodologies as well.
It does, and that's where some of the irony comes in.
Okay.
Because even the creators of some of those methodologies have expressed serious concerns about how SAFe is implementing their ideas.
Really, give me an example.
Okay, we'll take Lean UX.
Okay.
Jeff Gotthelf, one of the pioneers of Lean UX, has said that SAFe implementations completely miss the point of Lean UX principles.
So they're kind of like taking these well-established methodologies and like twisting them into something different.
That seems to be the consensus. And it's not just Lean UX.
Okay.
SAFe also puts a lot of emphasis on continuous delivery.
Right.
But Dave Farley, a leading expert in continuous delivery, argues that SAFe's release trains actually contradict continuous integration, which is a core Agile practice.
Okay, so for folks who might not be super familiar with these terms, can we just break down what release trains are and why they might clash with continuous integration?
Sure. So in SAFe, a release train is basically this long-lived team of Agile teams that plan, commit, and execute together in a synchronized cadence.
Okay.
And the idea is to create this predictable and coordinated release schedule.
Okay, I see.
The problem, according to critics like Dave Farley, is that this fixed schedule and the large batch size actually goes against the core principles of continuous integration, which advocates for frequent small integrations of code changes to avoid what's called integration hell and to enable faster feedback loops.
It sounds like SAFe is trying to have its cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
It's claiming to embrace these Agile practices, but simultaneously implementing them in a way that goes against their fundamental principles.
Exactly. And it raises the question, is SAFe really about scaling Agile, or is it just putting an Agile label on old waterfall-style ways of working?
That is the question, isn't it? And it seems like there's this real disconnect between SAFe's marketing and the actual experiences of people trying to implement it.
Absolutely. And that disconnect becomes even more apparent when we start to look at the feedback coming from practitioners, the people who are using SAFe day in and day out.
So the people in the trenches.
Exactly. And we'll delve into their experiences in part 2 of our deep dives.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into SAFe. We spent that last segment talking to some pretty big names and hearing some pretty serious concerns about this framework. But now it's time to really get down to the nitty-gritty and hear from the people who are actually using SAFe day in and day out.
You're right. We've got to hear from the trenches. And the SAFe Delusion does a great job of capturing those voices. It really delves into the experiences of practitioners who've had to actually work with SAFe firsthand.
So what are these practitioners saying? What are their main pain points?
One of the most common complaints you hear is that SAFe creates an incredible amount of overhead.
Overhead, like what?
There's just this massive emphasis on roles and processes and ceremonies, and it can feel so bureaucratic.
Okay, so in practice, what does that actually look like?
So for example, SAFe has this thing called PI planning.
PI planning.
Yeah, it stands for Program Increment Planning.
Okay.
And it's basically this huge planning event where multiple teams have to come together to align on a roadmap for a fixed period, usually a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is to foster collaboration. But a lot of practitioners find these PI planning events to be just way too long and rigidly structured.
Really?
Yeah. They end up feeling like they're spending more time in meetings and filling out forms than actually, getting any real work done.
It sounds like the opposite of Agile.
It really goes against that whole principle of valuing individuals and interactions over processes and tools.
Yeah, and this feeling of being bogged down by process seems like a recurring theme from what I'm hearing.
It is, and it ties into this sense of being micromanaged.
Okay.
So instead of feeling empowered to work autonomously and make quick decisions, they're constantly having to check in and get approvals and follow this rigid set of rules.
So instead of promoting agility, SAFe is actually stifling it.
That seems to be the consensus among a lot of practitioners, and it also brings us back to that potential clash between SAFE's release trains and the idea of continuous integration.
Right.
Because those fixed schedules and large batch sizes make it really hard to release software frequently and get that rapid feedback.
So it's harder to adapt to change and ultimately harder to deliver value quickly.
Exactly. And this goes against another core Agile principle, that whole idea of prioritizing working software over comprehensive documentation.
Right.
But with SAFE, there's often this huge emphasis on upfront planning and documentation, and it can sometimes feel like the balance has shifted away from working software and towards just, ticking boxes and making sure you've got all the paperwork in order.
It's like putting the cart before the horse.
It is, and it raises the question of whether all this process and documentation is actually leading to better outcomes.
Because I guess you could be hitting all your targets and checking all the boxes, but still not actually delivering any real value to your customers.
Exactly, and that's where another major criticism of SAFE comes in this focus on outputs rather than outcomes.
Can you explain that a bit more? Like, what's the difference between an output and an outcome?
Sure. So outputs are the things you produce, like lines of code or features or documents.
Okay.
Outcomes are the results you achieve, the actual impact you have.
I see. So it's not about how many features you ship. It's about what those features actually do.
Exactly. And the SAFE delusion points out that SAFE can sometimes lead to this culture of just churning out outputs without necessarily thinking about their real-world impact.
So you could be hitting all your velocity targets and, racking up the story points, but still not actually moving the needle on anything meaningful.
And the document actually quotes Kevin Bendler, an Agile practitioner, who points out that SAFE doesn't focus enough on feedback loops and learning. He argues that the emphasis on upfront planning and rigid timelines makes it difficult to adapt to changing customer needs and incorporate feedback effectively.
So there's a lack of flexibility and responsiveness, two qualities that are pretty essential for true agility.
Exactly. And this disconnect between SAFE's theoretical promises and its practical realities is what leads a lot of practitioners to question its effectiveness.
So it's like SAFE is creating this kind of like agile theater where everything looks agile on the surface, but underneath it's business as usual.
That's a great way to put it. And the SAFE delusion actually quotes another practitioner, Pauyer Hurin, who wrote this blog post called "Watch Out, Waterfall Ahead, The Truth About SAFE."
Okay.
And he argues that a lot of SAFE's approach to things like requirements and roles and planning all have this very distinctly waterfall feel to them.
Like trying to force fit agile into a traditional waterfall structure.
Exactly. And he also points out that SAFE's version of Scrum actually deviates quite a bit from the original Scrum framework.
Really?
Yeah, which can cause a lot of confusion and frustration for teams who are used to traditional Scrum.
So it's not even really Scrum, it's SAFE's interpretation of Scrum.
Right, and this can lead to this weird situation where teams are going through the motions of Agile ceremonies without actually embracing the underlying principles.
So we've heard from the big names, the Agile Manifesto authors, and now we're hearing from the people in the trenches. And there seems to be this pretty consistent message. SAFE might not be all it's cracked up to be.
It's a very valid concern.
But I'm sure there are other ways to approach scaling agility, right?
There are, and in part 3 of our deep dive, we'll explore one of those alternatives, something called framework agnostic agile.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've spent the last 2 parts really kind of dissecting SAFE and highlighting, some pretty major concerns about it. But, we don't want to just focus on the negative here.
No, of course not.
I mean, and the important question isn't just, is SAFE bad? It's what are the alternatives?
Right. And the SAFE delusion actually does a good job of pointing us in that direction.
Okay.
Because it's not just about criticizing SAFE, it's about this larger conversation around how we can scale agility effectively. And a lot of organizations are starting to explore something called framework agnostic agile.
Okay, framework agnostic agile. That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean? Is it like agile with no rules?
It's not quite no rules, but it's more about recognizing that there's no single framework that's going to solve every problem.
Okay.
So framework agnostic agile is about taking those core principles and values of agile things like collaboration, iterative development, customer focus, and applying them in a way that makes sense for your specific organization.
So it's kind of like taking the best bits of agile without being tied to a really strict set of rules.
Exactly. It's about understanding the why behind the practices, not just blindly following a recipe.
I see.
And the document actually quotes Alistair Cockburn, one of the original Agile Manifesto authors.
Okay.
And he makes this really interesting point. He says, instead of investing all this time and energy into complex frameworks, why not focus on the things that really matter?
Like what?
Things like improving collaboration and communication, because that's really the foundation of agility.
Yeah, that's so true. You can have like the most sophisticated framework in the world, but if your teams can't talk to each other, you're not going to get very far.
Exactly. And this emphasis on collaboration, it kind of naturally leads to another key aspect of framework agnostic agile, which is simplification.
Simplification.
Yeah.
How does that play into scaling agile? Because usually you think scaling means things get more complex.
You would think so, but one of the things that the SAFe delusion highlights is that a lot of the complexity in large organizations comes from dependencies.
Okay.
Dependencies between teams, departments, even systems.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So instead of adding more processes and frameworks to manage those dependencies, what if you could just reduce them or eliminate them?
That sounds lovely.
Yeah.
But how do you actually simplify a complex organization?
Well, it's not easy, but it is possible. And the document actually quotes Mary Poppendieck, who's, a real pioneer in lean software development.
Okay.
And she argues that a lot of these large agile frameworks are actually an excuse to avoid doing the hard work of sorting out your architecture and reducing dependencies.
So it's kind of like a Band-Aid solution.
Right. You're not addressing the root cause. You're just kind of slapping a framework on top of it.
And hoping for the best.
Exactly. So instead of doing that, you need to tackle the complexity head on.
How do you do that?
It might involve breaking down silos between teams, rethinking your organizational structure, maybe adopting more modern software architecture principles like microservices.
Okay.
These are all things that can give teams more autonomy and reduce the need for all that heavy coordination and control.
So it all comes back to being framework agnostic, right?
Right.
You're not limited by a specific framework. You can pick and choose the approaches that work best for you.
Exactly. It's about adapting agile to your organization, not the other way around.
Right.
And the SAFe delusion points out that more and more organizations are actually looking for agile practitioners who have this deep experience and can work effectively without being tied to a particular framework.
So it's more about experience and adaptability than just having a certification.
Absolutely.
So after this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that scaling agile is a journey. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's about truly embracing those agile values and principles, understanding your unique context, and finding the solutions that work for you, even if it means challenging conventional wisdom or stepping outside of the boundaries of popular frameworks.
That's a great message. Don't be afraid to experiment, to learn to adapt, and I think most importantly, never stop questioning and seeking out diverse perspectives.
Absolutely. And remember, the Agile Manifesto, it values individuals and interactions over processes and tools.
Right.
Don't let the framework become the focus.
So true.
It should be about the people and the outcomes.
Well said.
And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the SAFe delusion.
I think so.
Hopefully this has been insightful and maybe sparked some new ideas.
Yeah, it's definitely been thought-provoking.
And remember, keep learning, keep exploring, and never stop pushing those boundaries of what's possible with Agile.
That's great advice, and on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Sounds good.
See you next time.